So good afternoon everyone, I'm Wallace. Today I would like to share with you the findings of our research on dual antiplatelet therapy versus oral anticoagulant in patients with atrial fibrillation. I have no conflict of interest to disclose. So for the background, oral anticoagulation therapy is a standard therapy for stroke prevention in patients with atrial fibrillation. However, in reality, some patients may refuse using oral anticoagulants because of the fear of bleeding risk. As a result, in 2012, the European guidelines recommend that when patients refuse the use of any oral anticoagulant, including warfarin or the newer anticoagulant NOACs, may be considered using the combination therapy with aspirin plus clopidogrel. However, there are limited studies comparing these treatments in the clinical practice. So the objective of this study is to compare the effectiveness and safety outcomes between oral anticoagulants and dual antiplatelet therapy with aspirin plus clopidogrel. And we include two anticoagulants, which are warfarin and dabigatran in this study. So this is a population-based new user cohort study, and we use the data from the Hong Kong Clinical Data Analysis and Reporting System, which we call CDAS in short. So CDAS is developed by the Hong Kong Hospital Authority, which is a statutory body that manages all the public hospital and outpatient clinics for over 7 million people in Hong Kong. So CDAS contain the linked electronic medical records, including the demographics, the date of registered death, date of hospital admission and discharge, outpatient visits, as well as the drug dispensing records, diagnosis, procedures, and laboratory tests. And all the patient records are anonymized in CDAS. So here, the study population of our study is those new patients with atrial fibrillation between 2010 to 2012, and we followed them up until July 2016. So the index day is defined as the first prescription of either aspirin plus clopidogrel, warfarin, or dabigatran. And we follow them up from the index day until the end of study period, death or switching of treatment, or discontinuation of treatment, or the occurrence of outcomes, which include the primary outcomes are a composite of ischemic stroke, systemic embolism, and all-cause mortality. While the secondary outcomes are the composite of gastrointestinal bleeding and intracranial bleeding. And the period on and before index day is used to identify the baseline characteristics between in the treatment groups. We apply several exclusion criteria. The first one is we exclude those with alpha and transient AF, those aged less than 18 years old who died at first AF occurrence or sensor within 7 days after the index day. We also exclude patients with ischemic heart disease because compared to anticoagulants, the use of dual antiplatelet therapy is more commonly indicated for ischemic heart disease. So we want to exclude those with ischemic heart disease to reduce the systematic differences between the treatment group and make them more comparable. We use propensity score matching at 1:2 ratio, where one dual antiplatelet user is matched to two anticoagulant users, to further reduce the potential differences between the comparison groups. And we use logistic regression model to calculate the propensity score with the following factors, including the demographics, disease history, and recent medication use. Poisson regression was used to estimate the incidence rate ratio for the outcomes between treatment groups. So here are the results. We identified over 50,000 patients with a new diagnosis of atrial fibrillation between 2010 and 2014. Following the exclusion criteria, we got 5 we got 8,520 patients before propensity score matching. And after matching, we got around 2,000 patients in each comparison group, where we have around 1,200 morphine users and around 600 for dual-antipyretic, and around 900 dabigatran users and 500 dual-antipyretic users. The baseline characteristics after propensity score matching were all balanced, as indicated by the standardized difference of less than 0.1. So the mean age is about 74 years old, and almost half of them were female. And they have a mean Chadwick score of 3 from 6, which indicated they have a moderate to high risk of ischemic stroke. And for the distribution of concurrent recent drug use, they are all balanced after the propensity score matching. So here are the outcomes results. For the primary outcome, the anticoagulant group is associated with a lower risk of composite of ischemic stroke, systemic embolism, and all-cause mortality when compared to dual-antipyretic therapy. And when we break down the outcomes, the all-cause mortality has reached the statistical significance for the differences between the anticoagulant group and dual-antipyretic group. And for the bleeding outcomes, all the results were not significant, mainly due to the small number of event rates in our cohort. So the strength of this study is that, to our knowledge, this is the first study in an Asian population-based setting comparing dual-antipyretic therapy versus oral anticoagulant. And we use CDAS, which has a high coding accuracy, with a positive predicted values range from 90 to 100% and indicated from previous studies. And our study cohort was well matched by the propensity score, important comorbidities and concurrent medications. However, our study also has limitations. First, this is an observational study, so we cannot exclude the possibility of residual confounding factors. And the number of bleeding cases, as I mentioned, was relatively small, so we may not have enough power to detect any differences of bleeding risk between two groups. And the study only included dabigatran, and this is because the use of other NOACs, including rivaroxaban, apixaban, and edoxaban, in Hong Kong was limited during the study period. But the use of these NOACs is increasing in Hong Kong, so we have opportunities to study this NOAC in the coming studies. To conclude, this study shows that the use of dual-antipyretic therapy was associated with an increased risk of embolism and death compared to anticoagulant. And these findings support that anticoagulant may be a preferred treatment option in patients with atrial fibrillation. But further study for the bleeding risk is warranted to further confirm this. So here is other acknowledgement of this study. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your she's conducting the classical cohort study with new users. Are there any questions or comments? If not, I have one question. Could you explain in more detail how did you exclude prevalent cases in your cohort? Because usually we are excluding prevalent cases in initiating or prospective cohort study, and the screening period is very important for exclude the previously diagnosed prevalent cases. How did you exclude prevalent cases?
Did you mean the prevalent users or both? So actually, for the prevalent use of drugs, we first identify the days they have the first diagnosis of AF first, which is starting from 2010. Then we identified the first prescription of aspirin, clopidogrel, morphine, or dabigatran. And patients were assigned to either these three treatment groups according to that first prescription. So from this day, we screened the whole database to see whether they have another prescription for aspirin, clopidogrel, or morphine, or dabigatran before in that study. Because some patients may prescribe this drug before AF, so we did not.
So you have the information from 1993 to
Yeah.
2010.
Yes.
So you are screening the 17 years previously. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Other questions? Yes. Please.
Thanks very much. It's a very, very nice study we've done. I was interested in the same, I think I asked before, is the medication refill gap of more than 5 days seems very short, but maybe that's because all the data are collected because it's not dispensations. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yes. So actually the 5 days were derived from the median of the medical refill gap in our cohort. Actually the median, so we have studied all the gap between consecutive prescription for aspirin, clopidogrel, morphine, and dabigatran. And for morphine and dabigatran, the median gap is 5 days. For aspirin, clopidogrel actually is 20 days for some reasons. So we use a more aggressive approach to use 5 days to define the discontinuation of treatment. So we based on the median of the medication gap in our cohort. Yeah, the shortest one.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Huining Lin from National Taiwan University Health and Data Research Center. It is an honor to be here to present this study. So today I will be presenting a prevalent user design study evaluating the safety and effectiveness of oral anticoagulants. So here are our disclosure, and I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Simon Suisa up front to thank him for his insights in the design and the analysis of the study. So when evaluating the safety of the newly marketed drug in a real-world setting, ideally we would wish to include all patients exposed to the new drug. But first, we will also have to understand how this new drug may fit into current treatment framework. A new drug can be added to an old drug, or it can be switched from an old drug. And this old drug often serves as an active comparator in the pharmacoepidemiology study. So new users of a new drug, when ascertaining only on the new drug use, would be a heterogeneous group with or without the prior use of a comparator drug. So take oral anticoagulants, for example. So the NOACs are the new drug here. And new user of NOACs should be oral anticoagulant naive. However, in literatures, we find studies include oral anticoagulant non-naive patients into the new user design, as shown in the graph here, patient 2 here. And so in this case, when you include oral anticoagulant non-naive patient into the new user design, it may lead to underestimation of early events during a prior offering exposed person time, or you may neglect the effect of the prior drug use to your study. And also, a comparator like patient 3 here may not be an appropriate comparator, and instead, the 4th patient shown here in the graph may be a more appropriate comparator to use in the study. So in 2017, Dr. Simon Suisa presented this novel design called prevalent user design to address these issues. So for prevalent user designs, exposure sets are used, and exposure sets are formed when in the initiation of the study drug here. And the exposure sets you can control for the time interval from cohort entry up to the study drug initiation, or the number of prescriptions prior to the initiation of the study drug. And once the exposure sets are formed, time-conditional propensity score is estimated and propensity score matching is implemented, and then the study cohort is formed, and then you analyze or conduct your study just as like in conventional cohort study designs. So our objective was to implement this prevalent user design to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of dabigatran and warfarin while taking into account for the prior oral anticoagulant use experience. The data we used are the Taiwan National Health Insurance claims data and the mortality data from 2011 to 2015, and it is a nationwide data. So we first formed our base cohort by identifying non-valvular atrial fibrillation patients from 2002 to 2015. We identified the incident AF patients with at least 1 year look back. And then we identified patients having their first dabigatran or warfarin prescription prescribed after the AF diagnosis. And that prescription would be considered a cohort entry prescription. And then we implement the exclusion criteria is that we look at patients who had valvular heart disease, patients with valvular heart disease diagnosis or venous thromboembolism 6 months prior to the cohort entry would be excluded, or patients with duplicate cohort entry or anticoagulants would also be excluded. And patients who had prior rivaroxaban or apixaban use would also be excluded. So in the study, there will be two kinds of dabigatran patients. One will be considered the new users, which they initiated dabigatran right after the diagnosis of AF, and these will be considered new users. And then there are dabigatran switchers who entered the AF cohort with a warfarin prescription. So then we start forming our exposure sets. Once the dabigatran is initiation, we calculate the time interval from cohort entry between the index prescription, and we also evaluate for each warfarin prescription the time interval between the cohort entry. And to note here that while forming the exposure sets, the unit to evaluate is the prescription here. And then the second condition we look at is the prescription. The number of prescription prior to the index prescription. So we calculate the number of warfarin prescription prior to the index prescription and the alternative NOAC prescription prior to the index prescription. Combining the two conditions and requiring the comparator prescription to be within the same calendar year of the dabigatran prescription, the exposure sets are formed. The time and prescription-based exposure sets are formed. So within each exposure set, there will be one dabigatran prescription and multiple warfarin prescription. And we start estimating our time-conditional propensity score by using conditional logistic regression. And we use the covariates 90 days before the index prescription to put it to input into the propensity score model. And after estimating the propensity score, we conduct propensity score matching. We find the most comparable warfarin prescription within the exposure sets, having the nearest propensity score within the caliper to the dabigatran patients. And once the patient were matched, the unit to be evaluated becomes patients, and you follow up just like in any conventional cohort study designs. So the outcomes we look at includes the bleeding outcomes of intracranial hemorrhage, gastrointestinal bleeding, and also ischemic stroke for the effectiveness outcome. And also we evaluate all-cause mortality. And we center at the switch of oral anticoagulant, death, or end of study date. So for the statistical analysis, because we want to see how the propensity score matching and how it performs, how it controls the measure confounding. So we evaluate distribution of covariates among dabigatran users and warfarin users. But before matching, within each exposure set, there are multiple warfarin prescriptions or multiple warfarin users within each exposure set. So you randomly select one warfarin user from each exposure set to demonstrate the imbalance of the covariates distribution before propensity score matching. And we use the standardizing difference to evaluate the imbalance of distribution of covariates. Then for the propensity score estimation, as mentioned earlier, we use conditional logistic regression. So the propensity score is calculated from the coefficients output from the model and conditioning out the intercepts. And lastly, for outcome analysis, we use Cox proportional hazard model. And And because in our study design, we reuse patients, meaning that if a bigotron patient having the prior warfarin person time being comparable to another bigotron patient, these person time will be accounted for. So we use a robust sandwich covariance metric estimate to estimate a more appropriate variance. So for the results, for the incident AF-based cohort, we identified 28,000 non-valvular atrial fibrillation patients. So here you can see the randomly selected warfarin patients within each exposure set, and the center line, absolute value of standardized mean difference here demonstrates the imbalance of the measured confoundings before propensity score matching, and after matching, the absolute value falls below 0.1, so we consider the measured confoundings being controlled for. So for the outcome analyses here, we observed a decreased risk of intracranial hemorrhage bleeding and also gastrointestinal bleeding. And we also observed a 40% decreased risk of all-cause mortality among the bigotron users versus warfarin users. However, we did not see a statistical significant difference between the prevention of ischemic stroke between the bigotron users and warfarin users. Here we would like to specifically look at the subgroup analyses of stratifying by the prior oral anticoagulant use in experience. And you can see here in the graph here that the bleeding risk or the pulse mortality risk did not differ among users and switchers. But interestingly is that it did differ among users and switchers for the stroke prevention, where the results favor the bigotron among users and favors warfarin among switchers. So the main finding is what I shared in the table. I'm probably not repeated here, but I would like to share my thoughts with you on about the prevalent user design. Is that this design is especially informative in the early stage of post-marketing safety studies when drug users may not only, when in real world of patients, drug users may not consist of new users only, and a proportion of the patient may be switchers. So this study includes both new users and switchers, which I find very informative. And then by the use of the exposure sets, it controls for the heterogeneity of new drug initiators. And thirdly is that for the prior warfarin person time can be accounted for if the warfarin person is at the time is comparable to another the bigotron patient. So this may account for the early outcome events, which is sometimes criticized for the prevalent user designs. And lastly, because there are increasing discussion about broken matches and subgroup analysis for propensity score matching studies, and here I would like to emphasize that the propensity score matching is conducted within the exposure sets, so there will not be any broken matches when we do the subgroup analysis stratifying by the prior oral anticoagulant use experience. So this is at the end of my presentation, and thank you.
Frank May from South Australia. Thank you, that was a wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you could just reflect for a moment on the clinical implications of your finding, particularly around the ischemic stroke, which appeared to be quite different from many of the other clinical factors that you had looked at as in outcomes.
Clinical implications. So actually, when I did, this is a part of my thesis project, and after I finished the analysis, I went back to the RCTs, and then I realized that for the bigotron RCT, while they were recruiting patients, there were some issues about collecting the information of prior warfarin use in the trials. So actually they did a post hoc analysis afterwards and using several sensitivity analyses, but I didn't find it really, so I still find that because the information wasn't collected exactly clearly during the RCT, so my results cannot directly compare with it. And I just feel like with the design of the studies in the future, maybe we can more appropriately address the use of the issues of switching, at least within the real world data. Yeah, that is my...
I have other words for Frank's question. Are there any mechanism of action of cardiovascular differently to the ischemic stroke or hemorrhage? Is that the explanation?
Sorry, I don't really know of it, but I'll definitely look it up. And, yes.
And my question is, curiosity or interesting methodology concept. Have you compared the result using the use design and traditional user for design?
Traditional user design. So I would consider my subgroup analysis of a user subgroup analysis is the traditional user design. So at least for me, for the bleeding outcomes, it's more assuring to us that, okay, there's no difference. But then for the ischemic stroke outcomes, we do observe a difference here. So another thing I was thinking about is probably to, in the future, to refine the operational definition of ischemic stroke, because it may not be only like the only event for these patients. So in claims data, it may be difficult to sometimes be difficult to identify whether it's an outcome event or is it a history event and recorded in the claims. So maybe that's something I should refine in the future. That's something I was considering about.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Fanning. I'm from Monash University. I'm a PhD candidate at Monash. Today we'll be presenting on the prevalence, safety and effectiveness of oral anticoagulant use in people with and without dementia or cognitive impairment, and this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. Atrial fibrillation, dementia or cognitive impairment are common conditions of ageing, and hence they frequently occur together. Evidence shows that there is potential underutilisation of oral anticoagulants in people with dementia, even though people with dementia experience increased rates of stroke and mortality. However, people with dementia may also be at increased risk of bleeding, such as bleeding linked to traumatic falls or intracranial bleeding. Current guidelines for stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation provide variable information regarding the prescribing of oral anticoagulants for people with dementia. European Society of Cardiology guidelines recommend withholding oral anticoagulants when medication adherence cannot be assured by a caregiver. On the other hand, the American Neurology guidelines state there's insufficient safety and effectiveness data available for oral anticoagulants in people with dementia. And the Australian Stroke guidelines provide information for frail older adults, but do not provide any dementia-specific information. Therefore, the aim of this study was to identify published data comparing the prevalence, safety and effectiveness of oral anticoagulants in people with and without dementia, and to summarise this data using meta-analysis. So we conducted a systematic search of the literature in multiple databases to extract literature from 2000 to 2017. We used a range of mesh terms, entry terms, keywords and truncated search terms relating to dementia, cognitive impairment and oral anticoagulants. The protocol was registered in Prospero and we followed the PRISMA statement for conducting the review and also reporting the results. Studies of all forms of dementia were eligible for inclusion, including cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's dementia, which represents around 80% of dementia cases, and also vascular, mixed and Lewy body dementia. We included studies that presented separate data on prevalence, effectiveness and safety for dementia and non-dementia groups, and this data could be reported at either an anticoagulant class level, such as VKAs or vitamin K antagonists or direct oral anticoagulants, or at an individual drug level. We excluded studies that reported data for dementia, people with dementia only, and we also excluded studies that aggregated results for oral and parenteral anticoagulants or antiplatelets and anticoagulants combined. The screening process was conducted by 2 reviewers independently as well as the data extraction. We extracted data on study details, the prevalence of dementia or cognitive impairment, and also the type of dementia the individual had, the methods used to identify dementia, the indications for the oral anticoagulants, and then the data for prevalence, safety and effectiveness was extracted separately for dementia and non-dementia groups. So we identified over 4,000 articles through electronic and hand searches of the literature, of which 27 were finally included in this review. 21 studies reported data for the prevalence of oral anticoagulant use in people with and without dementia, and most of these were cross-sectional studies. 6 studies reported safety and effectiveness information for people with and without dementia. For the 27 studies, 20 of those reported information regarding warfarin. One study included DOACs and warfarin, and the other studies either had warfarin or VKAs combined. In terms of indications, 24 of the 27 studies reported data for stroke prevention in AF. The other 3 studies also reported on stroke prevention in AF, but had some other indications included. So this figure shows the mean prevalence of oral anticoagulant use overall, and also stratified by healthcare setting in people with and without dementia. On the left-hand side, you can see that people with dementia had around 32% prevalence of oral anticoagulant use, compared to 48% in people without dementia. When we stratified by healthcare settings, so community, the prevalence remained the same for people with dementia. It was also similar in the hospital setting, but in long-term care, the prevalence of oral anticoagulant use increased to nearly 50%. These are the results of the meta-analysis. The overall meta-analysis for all healthcare settings combined showed that people with dementia had significantly lower prevalence of oral anticoagulant use. They had They had 52% lower odds of receiving oral anticoagulants compared to people without dementia. When we looked at studies that were conducted in the community setting, we found that people with dementia had 60% reduced odds of receiving oral anticoagulants. For studies conducted in hospitals or stroke centres, people with dementia had 50% lower odds of receiving oral anticoagulants. However, in long-term care, people had increased odds compared to the other settings, but they still had 44% lower odds of receiving oral anticoagulants compared to people without dementia. We also conducted several sensitivity analyses to understand whether this had any impact on results, and we had no, and these analyses had no significant influence on the results that we found. We also wanted to look at the prevalence of oral anticoagulant use over time. This is mainly due to the fact that the introduction of the DOACs occurred internationally from about 2010 in different countries. You can see here that people, the blue line represents people with dementia and the red line is people without dementia. We basically plotted the prevalence of oral anticoagulants in dementia and non-dementia groups by mid-year of the study observation period, and then fitted a linear trend line. The prevalence of oral anticoagulant use in both groups is increasing over time, but there's perhaps an increasing use in people with dementia, demonstrated by the blue line. So 6 studies presented outcomes for oral anticoagulant use for people with and without dementia. Due to the small number of studies that we found, and also the diverse nature of outcomes that were reported in these studies, we were unable to meta-analyse these results. I'll first discuss the effectiveness outcomes, and then I'll talk about safety outcomes. So people who had, for the composite outcome of stroke, systemic embolism, myocardial infarction and all-cause mortality, we found that people with dementia people without dementia had a reduced risk of this outcome, but when the authors actually adjusted for time and therapeutic range, this risk became non-significant. A very small study of 57 patients found that there was no difference in the risk of thrombosis between dementia and non-dementia groups. And thirdly, another small study, which is actually cited in quite a lot of the international guidelines for stroke prevention, found there's increased risk of mortality in people with dementia, but no differences in bleeding and stroke risks. 4 studies reported safety outcomes for anticoagulation control. One study found that people residing in the community with dementia spent significantly lower time in therapeutic range, so 38% compared to 61% in people without dementia. However, there were 2 other studies conducted in anticoagulation clinics that showed no differences in results or time spent in therapeutic range between people with dementia and without dementia. There was also a long-term care study that found no differences in INR values between these groups. So in terms of safety outcomes with the adverse effects of using oral anticoagulants, any bleeding, one study reported this, so a reasonably sized study found that there was an increased rate of any bleeding in people with dementia, so 42 events per 100 person years compared to only 7 in people without dementia. But conversely, a descriptive study in the community found there was no difference in hemorrhage rates in people with and without dementia. And also for a study conducted in an anticoagulation clinic, there was no differences in minor and major bleeding in people with and without dementia. There was one study conducted in long-term care which looked at adverse warfarin events, and they found that there was an increased risk of these events in people with dementia, demonstrated by an increased incident rate ratio of 1.48 in people with dementia. Our study certainly has some limitations. First, the primary data sources have limitations in that the comparisons were mainly derived from subgroup analyses of observational studies. These studies did not examine anticoagulation in relation to cognitive status as their main objective. This resulted in the calculation of crude odds ratios in the meta-analyses, and therefore no adjustments have been made for confounding factors. Further, information about cognitive status may be limited. For example, dementia and cognitive impairment were derived in different ways in various studies, and the severity of dementia was not consistently reported. I think this links back into the fact that it wasn't the main objective of the studies included in this review. The effect of the use of data from observational studies and the fact that it was subgroup analyses, and also the heterogeneity of dementia definitions on our findings is unknown. Our meta-analysis also showed substantial heterogeneity demonstrated by high I-squared values, and therefore some caution should be used when interpreting these results. Also, the participants of these studies included in the review may have, because they have been diagnosed with dementia and are included for that reason, they may have more severe dementia or cognitive impairment. Thus, we don't know whether these results are generalisable to all patients with cognitive impairment and dementia. And also, all the studies were conducted in the UK, rest of Europe and North America, and therefore we don't understand the generalisability of these results to Australian or Asian populations. So in conclusion, people with dementia have 52% lower odds of receiving oral anticoagulants compared to people without dementia. The mean prevalence of oral anticoagulant use was 32% compared to 48% in people without dementia. However, over the time period, we're seeing increasing oral anticoagulant use in both groups. And lastly, 6 studies compared safety and effectiveness outcomes among people with and without dementia. However, these studies reported diverse outcomes and also variable results. So indeed, future research is required to understand the safety and effectiveness of oral anticoagulants in dementia. Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question. What do you think about compliance or adherence of dementia patients for oral anticoagulants?
Sure. So I suppose one of the guidelines, so the European Society of Cardiology guidelines do say that oral anticoagulants should be withheld if adherence cannot be, provided by a caregiver or assured by that caregiver. As a clinical pharmacist, I think that people with dementia may have poor adherence or compliance, and we can see in some of those results they demonstrate increased time outside of the therapeutic range. And when we adjust for that, their outcomes are actually similar to people without dementia. In the work that we've done, we haven't found many studies that have looked at the use of the direct oral anticoagulants. I think that potentially compliance could be changed with those. They've got fixed dosing regimens. They don't need to be monitored like warfarin does, so we could see some improvement in that in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for your
Craig's got a question.
Well,
sorry, I can see you.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, you mentioned the heterogeneity in your different studies that you've included in this meta-analysis. I'm wondering if you'd like to reflect on how important it is if the numbers flash past very quickly, but I could see that there was quite a differential in the different elements in terms of heterogeneity. And I guess I would be very controversial and say how much should we believe when there is this level of heterogeneity? And is there any other way beyond meta-analysis of actually getting at the questions, which are very good ones, which you are asking?
Yeah, so I think it's certainly a problem. We saw a significant heterogeneity in the meta-analyses. One attempt to reduce that or to see if there was any factors influencing that was we did do a range of subgroup analyses. I haven't gone through those in the presentation due to time, but this work is published and they're included in an appendix. But we found that none of those sensitivity analyses changed the heterogeneity of the meta-analysis. But there's lots of, I suppose, our other attempt in looking at what was influencing that was dividing it up by healthcare setting as well, so seeing if there was different factors that were affecting that. We couldn't look at prescriber characteristics from the data we had available, but the setting was one attempt to I suppose, weed that out a little bit. Yeah, and I think, the only way, the second part of the question, the only way to get around this is to actually go and do some observational studies in this patient group.
In this talk, I would like to present you an example of using real-world data to investigate the use of bisphosphonates in patients with chronic kidney disease. Here is our founding source and our disclosure. Bisphosphonate is being designed to treat osteoporosis by reducing how quick and how much the bone has been absorbed. In the clinical trial setting, many people with chronic kidney disease was excluded in the clinical trial, although these people have an increasing risk of fracture as well as osteoporosis. In the UK guideline suggests that permit the use of bisphosphonate for patients with chronic kidney disease if the chronic disease is failing, such as the eGFR is smaller than 15. However, the majority of chronic kidney disease patients was left to the physician to decide whether they should be given bisphosphonate use. And the big study, our study, was to address the British HTA code to investigate the use of safety and efficacy of the oral bisphosphonate in chronic kidney disease patients. A cohort has been identified using the CPRD database, and we use the data linked to the hospital record. And here are our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the patient will be followed up from the time when their first eGFR is smaller than 45. And for the non-users, if they the follow-up period will be based on the eGFR measurement up to 10 years. During the 10 years period, if they switch to become users, they will be contribute to the non-user as well as the user. For the non-user time will be censored from the time to the time they've been switched to the user. And for the users, the follow-up periods will be censored from the last prescription plus 180-day period. We are not interested in any suspension EGF and user time or the non-user time. In one of our work package, we first defined the renal function decline as the worsen. Stage worsen is defined as a time when the inpatient stage firstly moving down. As clearly shown on this graph here, for these 3 patients, they all been classified having an event at 6 years, despite they have a different starting EGFR value, as well as a different rate of EGFR change before this have an event. To better use of all the EGFR data, we also define EGFR. We also define an endpoint as an annual change in EGFR. Yes. So analysis to account for the measurable factor. Each BP user was potentially score matched up to 5 non-user based on 46 covariance, including age, gender, and smoking, and alcohol use, as well as comorbidity and related or other disease and prescription. For 3 particularly covariants such as BMI, smoking, and alcohol use, CPRD has a large proportion of the missing data. So we use the missing data imputation by chain to deal with such missing data, which means for each of the 10 imputed data sets, we have we create one dependent score matching cohort, and then the result will be combined together using Robert's rule. And the stage worsen analysis was applied to using the cost model and the mixed effect model with the cubic spine, and the interaction test was used to apply to evaluating the EGFR change. The cubic spine we use the cubic spine to identify the potential nonlinear change, and the interaction terms was being used to identify the mean change for BP user as well as non-user. The results. 6,000 BP users were perpendicular score matched to 24,000 non-users. The data, due to the time limit, don't really show the perpendicular score matching results, but for each of the 46 covariants, we have a very good 9 point. I think all the S and D is less than 9.1. For the BP user, we have found the increasing 50% of increase of stage. For the BP users, we have found the hazard ratio of 1.54, which indicating the user have a 50% of increasing risk of stage worsen compared to a non-user. However, as you can see on this table, the majority of people actually, during the follow-up period, their EGFR either stay the same stage or the EGFR moving up. So this analysis only focuses on this group. In the secondary endpoint, when we're using the all variable EGFR value in the mixed effect model, overall, we would say we don't observe a huge decline in EGFR value. As you can see in the y-axis here, the range of y-axis here is quite small. For the non-users, the highest EGFR value to the lowest EGFR value is less than 10 units. And for the users, actually the change is less than 5 units. But in the first 3 years, we both observe an increasing change of EGFR in both groups, and followed by decreasing change. And after 8 years of the bisphosphonate use, we don't find any difference. As you might have observed now, this result is contradiction to what we have been seeing before. In the stage worsen analysis, we saw a BP user have an increasing for kidney function, whereas here we don't see such effect. When we're looking at more detail, what we found is a mixed effect model have one important assumption, which means within the same stage, and users within the same stage, people need to follow the general chain as which is what is being shown here. So the individuals' EGFR change in the same group need to be similar to what is the mean curve here. But this is not the case here. So heterogeneity is one of the issues. So we saw this is why we can see a large range of the observed EGFR value in each time point and compared to the mean curve. So this suggests us that this result, the EGFR result, need to be interpreted with caution. Sorry. In conclusion, bisphosphonate users are more likely to decrease in CKD stage. For each 45 patients given the 3 years of treatment, and 4 were changed to the worsened stage. However, on average, we can say those EGFR changes are quite stable, but a large heterogeneity on individual trajectory in EGFR has been observed. So, two particular main limitations of this study is the CKD, the renal function, are defined using EGFR only. We try to link to our data to renal registry, to including dialysis as well as kidney transplant. But due to the GDPR regulation, we were not able to link the data until the study has been complete. EGFR value has been measured in this study has been measured based on creatinine as well as the CKD formula. And our sensitivity analysis shows, and which is focused on the same formula, and shows similar results. Thank you for listening, and here is it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're still over here, even though it's getting quite late in the afternoon. So my talk is about the incidence and prevalence of oral anticoagulant use in people with acquired dementia in Australia, and also given the predictors of oral anticoagulant use. These are the funding sources. So, as we heard from Laura's talk about 15 minutes ago, she basically gave a background for my talk. So, my first point is actually about overview. So, people with dementia are 50% less likely to receive oral anticoagulation compared to people without dementia. This is despite the fact that people with dementia are at increased risk of stroke. And those who survive stroke are at increased risk of having a decline in physical functioning. They are more likely to experience disability, less likely to be discharged home after hospitalization. So this treatment disparity in people without dementia might be due to the perceived difficulties in managing the complex warfarin regimen. Sorry, I'm just not very good at this technology. So the complex regimen and the difficulties in monitoring the INR. Also, the susceptibility of the adverse drug events in people with dementia is a concern, especially regarding bleeding events. The changing goals of care in people with limited life expectancy might be another reason for the disparity. So direct oral anticoagulants that have been marketed a few years ago have a simpler dosing regimen and require less monitoring than warfarin. Drugs also may have different structured profiles than warfarin. However, we know quite little about how the introduction of the drugs have affected the use of oral anticoagulants in people with dementia. So the aim of this study was to investigate the incidence and prevalence of warfarin and drug use and determine the predictors of drug compared to warfarin use in people with dementia and also in the general older population in Australia. Earlier today we heard about the pharmaceutical benefit scheme data that Deborah talked about in the first symposium in the morning. So we utilized this data for our study. This is a 10% random sample of the PBS database, representing about 10% of Australians who are eligible for the PBS reimbursement. In addition to all medication relevant information, this database includes information information about the year of death, the year of birth, and the sex of the individual, and also the consensus status and the state of the pharmacy. For this study, we utilized data from about 350,000 people aged 65 years or older, and the study period was from July 2013 to June 2017. So we defined dementia based on dispensing of anti-dementia medications, and the person was considered having dementia from the year when they had their first anti-dementia medication dispensed. And for this purpose, we utilized data from the inception of the database, which is March 2005, to make sure that we capture definitely anybody who has ever been dispensed dementia medication. Oral anticoagulants include warfarin and also all direct oral anticoagulants that are currently marketed in Australia, rivaroxaban, apixaban, and dabigatran. The person was considered an oral anticoagulant user if at least one dispensing of a DOAC or warfarin in the corresponding study years was present. So we defined the annual incidence of oral anticoagulant use by dividing the number of people who had an oral anticoagulant dispensed in a given year, but there was no dispensing in the previous financial year. The annual prevalence of the oral anticoagulant use was defined as the number of people who had an oral anticoagulant dispensed in the given year among people who were at risk of being dispensed or were present in our database. So the predictors were determined during the 1 year preceding before the index of the first oral anticoagulant dispensing. So we utilized data from July 2012 onwards to make sure that those who initiate July 2030 will also have that 1 year capture period. The predictors that we included were limited to the data source that we had, so it included age, sex, years since the anti-dementia medication initiation, and comorbidities that were defined using the risk index. The changes in the annual prevalence and incidence of oral anticoagulant use were analyzed using personal repression, and the predictors were estimated using multivariable logistic regression, and all the analyses were conducted separately for people with dementia and the general population. So the results, these are this is the study sample. So in people with dementia, we had up to 8,800 people in any given year having dementia, and then the general population sample varied from just over 200,000 to about 350,000 in the last year. Age distribution varies in people with dementia and in the general population, having more people in the age category of 85 and older in the dementia cohort and than the general population, and that's why we present our rate ratios stratified by the age group. So the incidence of oral anticoagulant, I'm pointing at this side of the screen. If somebody is looking at that screen, you can't see my pointer. So the incidence of oral anticoagulant use in people with dementia declined regarding warfarin. So it declined from about 0.8% to about 0.4%. And in people without dementia, it declined as well. The incidence of direct oral anticoagulant use remains the same, also, although there is a dip from the first year to the second year, but it stayed more or less stable from the beginning to the end. So there's maybe a slight increase, but not much. One reason for this might be that there was the patient familiarization program from June 2011 in Australia for dabigatran and a bit later for rivaroxaban, which might mean that these incident users actually might be prevalent users because they were in the familiarization program before, and that's why we see this apparent decline and that name in the picture. So when we look at the rate ratios for the change in incidence of oral anticoagulant use, We can see that the warfarin use indeed declined in all of the age groups, in both the dementia cohort and in the general population. The rate ratio being about 60% less, so the 60% is likely to initiate warfarin in the last study year compared to the reference year of 2013-14. In the direct oral anticoagulant initiation, we saw that in the age group of 85 years and older, there is this slight increase in the initiation in the last year compared to first year, although it's not a big increase. So the prevalence follows similar pattern. So the prevalence of warfarin use declines from about 7% to about 4.5%. However, the prevalence of direct oral anticoagulant use increases to the extent that the overall oral anticoagulant prevalence increases in people with dementia from 8% to 11.5%, and in people in the general population from 9% to 11.5%. And this is similar kind of finding what Laura saw, that over time there is a slight increase in the oral anticoagulant use in people with dementia, which is then due to the increase in drug use. And looking at the rate ratios, we can see similar pattern to the initiation. So there is a decrease in warfarin over time and an increase in the direct oral anticoagulant use. In terms of the predictors, we found that an older people, of those 85 and older, are still less likely to receive a direct oral anticoagulant compared to warfarin, although there has been this kind of steep increase in the use. And women are less likely in people with dementia receiving direct oral anticoagulants compared to men. In terms of the clinical characteristics, we found that people with arrhythmias are more likely to receive direct oral anticoagulants versus warfarin, and people with pain or inflammation have similar patterns, or more likely to receive direct oral anticoagulant compared to warfarin. So in terms of strength of our study, we had a nationally representative sample of older Australians included. We captured hospital discharge dispensing in addition to the community dispensing in most of Australian states. And we also captured dispensing for people living in residential aged care, which is important for this cohort. However, we did not have access data for the oral anticoagulant indication, so most of people would have atrial fibrillation, but some people would have received oral anticoagulation for other indications. No, we didn't have any outcome data, which would have been interesting to look at. Antidementia medications are only reimbursed in Australia for Alzheimer's disease, so unfortunately we didn't capture any other dementias other than Alzheimer's disease. And further, not all people with Alzheimer's disease receive antidementia medication, which means that we didn't capture everybody with dementia in our dementia cohort. That's why we couldn't do a cohort of people without dementia. That's why our reference cohort had to be the general population, because otherwise we would have been having a lot of people with dementia in our dementia cohort. So to conclude my talk, people with dementia are increasingly dispensed oral anticoagulants. Clinicians are more likely to initiate drugs compared to warfarin in people with dementia, particularly in those who are 85 years or older. And while the introduction of drugs appears have really overcome the disparity in overall oral anticoagulant dispensing, we still don't know enough about the safety and effectiveness of direct oral anticoagulant use in people with dementia. Neither we know much about the warfarin, as Laura mentioned in her systematic review presentation, so there's a lot of critical research in this area. Thank you.
I have a question actually. You mentioned that the safety and effectiveness of the drugs in people with dementia remains uncertain. Do you think this might be a possible reason for the low use of of the ones on OAC's general in general into specific population? And my second question is, do you have any suggestions how to improve the use of the oral anticoagulants in this population?
Can you please repeat the first question? I didn't quite hear.
The last sentence, the safety and effectiveness. It is a reason, possible reason for the low use of the OACs in this population?
I think it's just most randomized controlled trials exclude people with dementia. That's why we have limited RCT data for this patient group. Also, even though it's a prevalent disease getting more and more prevalent, it's still the numbers of people with dementia is small. So even the observational studies sometimes don't have enough power to investigate people with dementia as a specific group. That's why there is limited data, I believe. The second question was about the
policy suggestions.
Suggested to decrease the disparity. I think the reason why people with dementia are not prescribed this medication is a subsequent from the lack of data that we have. So there isn't enough studies to suggest that people with dementia would benefit or not benefit from these treatments. So maybe the reluctance of prescribing comes from that. Maybe people with dementia, they thought that maybe limited life expectancy, we don't want to risk the person having a bleed, which might have very detrimental outcomes. So the balance between the harms and the benefits, maybe looking at aspirin utilization, other thrombotics in people with dementia, we might find that that's the alternative for oral anticoagulation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming. My name is Kate. I'm a PhD student from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. It's a pleasure to be here today, and today I'll be presenting on the use of falls risk medications in people at high and low falls risk in aged care services. As we all know, globally we have a rapidly aging population. As a result, we also have an increasing population of people who are going into aged care, also known as nursing homes or long-term care facilities in other countries. As you can see here, the graph here on the left, this is in Australia. Most of the residents who live in aged care services are older, mostly 65 years or above, so that's 60 to 64. So as you can see, most of the people fall in that spectrum in terms of age. So residents of residential aged care facilities are at a high risk of falls, usually due to being an older age and also due to frailty. The risk of falling is associated with falls risk increasing drugs, which typically include psychotropic medications as well as medications that causes orthostatic hypotension. So the aim of our study was to determine the prevalence and factors associated with the use of falls risk increasing drugs or falls risk medications in residents of aged care facilities. So we conducted a cross-sectional study using baseline data from a 2-year prospective cohort study. Data collection, so the baseline data collection occurred between April to August 2014, and we collected data from 6 different metropolitan and regional residential aged care services in South Australia. So for those of you who know South Australia very well, it's mainly from Adelaide and Mount Gambier. So we included 383 residents of aged care facilities. We only included those who are 65 years or older with an estimated life expectancy of at least 3 months, meaning that we excluded those who are receiving palliative treatment. The mean age of our sample was 87.5 years, which is quite a well-represented cohort of the mean age in Australian aged care facilities, and 77.5% of our sample were females. So we assessed participants' falls risk using a modified version of Delbaire's falls risk algorithm tool, as seen here. So we started off assessing whether or not residents can stand unaided, and we had a definition for yes and no. So if the residents can stand unaided, then we assessed if the residents had two or more of the following variables, which includes any falls, history of falls, whether they're receiving high care or urinary continence, and from that we can determine whether or not they're receiving low or high, whether or not they're at low or high falls risk. If the resident cannot stand unaided, then we assess to see whether or not any of one or more of the following variables applied, which is a history of falls, whether they're receiving low care or whether they had an exposure to polypharmacy, which in this incidence is defined as the use of 9 or more regular medications. And from that we can determine whether or not the resident is at a low or a high falls risk. So this slide shows some of the basic prevalence results. So falls risk medications in our study were defined according to the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare, which is referenced here in the article. So this mainly covers two main categories of falls risk medications, which were psychotropic medications and medications that causes orthostatic hypotension. So this slide here only shows the prevalence of psychotropic medications between residents by high and low falls risk. So as you can see here on this graph, medications which showed a significant difference in prevalence between high and low falls risk groups were opioids, so asterisks here, and antipsychotics, but excluding lithium, and all the medications were coded using ATC codes. So this is the second part of that graph. So this is the prevalence of regular users of medications that causes orthostatic hypertension, again by high and low falls risk. And as you can see here, this category of medications actually covers a very extensive list of cardiovascular medications, including your antihypertensives, diuretics, beta blockers, and calcium channel blockers. It's also wanted to point out that the only one which showed a significance in terms of difference in the prevalence were again the antipsychotics excluding lithium, which is the same as the page before. Okay, so this is actually one graph that's being split into two sections just so that we can see a bit better. So we calculated the propensity score for high and low falls risk after considering for a number of different covariates, including age, sex, activities of daily living, frailty, number of regular medications, different comorbidities, and nutrition. The standardized differences between high and low falls risk, so I'm not sure if you can see it, it's a bit blurry. So the standardized differences between high and low falls risk groups were evaluated before and after inverse probability weighing. So the results here shows that before weighing, the baseline characteristics of the groups were different. So before weighing, it's the black brown dots, as you can see, it's quite, some of them are actually quite far from the zero standardized mean difference, and after weighing, the prevalence is rebalanced, and the standardized difference have moved all closer towards that zero standardized difference, showing that they have been effectively controlled, and most of them were within that 0.2 range. Okay, so we conducted a multinomial logistic regression after adjusting for the confounders through inverse probability weighing, and as you can see here, highlighted in red, residents at high falls risks also had ratio of 1.75. And similarly, for people at high falls risk are also more likely to be taking medications which causes or worsens orthostatic hypertension, and it's not just 2 or more, it's also 1 as well. So you can see here, these are significant odds ratios. So, and then after pooling psychotropics and OH medications together, which is this graph here, we found that there was a positive association between high falls risk and using 2 or more falls risk medications. I also just wanted to point out also that most of the residents who use the falls risk medications actually had corresponding documented clinical indications as well. So that was one of the findings. In terms of strengths and limitations, so the sample, we definitely had some strengths. So the sample was recruited from both metropolitan and rural areas. And we're confident to say that we had accurate medication exposure extracted from the residents' medication chart within 24 hours of baseline data collection. And our study also definitely had some limitations. So we had prevalent medication exposure only, which was collected at baseline. So any changes to medications during follow-up, any prior use of medications were not accounted for. And also we did not include the date or the number of previous falls when working out the falls risks for the residents. Okay, so in conclusion, so the use of falls risk medications is still high in residents of aged care services. Residents at a high falls risk also had higher prevalence of taking 2 or more falls risk medications, which would obviously further increases their falls risk. However, we do encourage longitudinal studies in the future to determine causality, and we also highly encourage medication reviews and attempts to cease any unnecessary falls risk medications to improve falls risks in residents of aged care services. And just to highlight, it's unnecessary falls risk medications. So any of the cardiovascular medications, for example, it would need to be evaluated in residents who are at high cardiovascular risks as well. Okay, thank you very much for that.
First of all, congratulations again on really a very great deal of work. I understand this was work which was done on site prospectively in collecting this data. One only is amazed at your ability to do that.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask you why you didn't, instead of looking at prevalence, why you didn't use one of the dose standardization systems such as the DDD to actually evaluate more or come closer to actually understanding the weight of burden associated with potential falls risk. Using prevalence, of course, is useful, but one imagines that it might be more useful to have a DDD which actually guides and gives some indication of the extent to which people are being exposed to falls risk medications. And finally, did you say 9 medications concurrently?
Yes, so polypharmacy was defined as the use of 9 or more regular medications. So we excluded any PRN, so when required or as needed medications.
And if you'd like to just reflect on being able to become a little more sensitive by use of something like DVDs.
Yes. So I think in terms of this study, when we conducted this study, we were actually quite limited because we obtained the baseline data from an existing prospective cohort study. We were kind of quite limited in terms of what we do, but I do if we can if we were able to consider the doses, that would have been really helpful. Also, another thing we looked at was in terms of falls risk. So that list of falls risk medications from the that we use, so the psychotropics and the OH medications. I agree with you. I think it would have been really good to incorporate the doses and actually define to see whether or not they would actually, if there's like a dose-response relationship in terms of falls risk. That's potentially definitely